Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Agreed.
And first of all, I want to welcome the bill and say well done to Fianna Fáil in relation to this bill. And of course, there is a background to it, and the Irish Penal Reform Trust has long called for such a change and for the Parole Board to be put on a statutory basis. And indeed, it was a key recommendation of the strategic review of penal policy back in 2014. So there is a background to this, and thank you to Fianna Fáil for doing something about it. Generally, the bill is very good. I have no difficulty with it and will be supporting the bill. However, there are a number of things that I would just like to highlight, and maybe at the committee stage they can be looked at in terms of section 24. If we just look at section 24 in relation to the variation of a parole order. The whole purposes of the bill is to establish an independent parole board, utterly independent of political control and of the government. And yet in section 24 we have, on the direction of a minister, that the order may be changed. So I would just like that to be looked at in terms of how that infringes on the independence of the parole board. In relation to section 18 and 19, the guiding principles and the criteria for parole, again, of themselves, I have no difficulty with them, and quite clearly the safety of the community, the family and the victims has to be paramount before we release prisoners. But there would seem to be an undue emphasis on the offence that was committed a number of years, obviously prior to the parole board seeing the prisoner, and not enough emphasis on the current risk assessment that pertains at the point where the parole board are making a decision whether the prisoner should be released into society and whether there's a risk at that stage. So just the current risk posed at the time that the decision is being made. And the second thing is the standard of proof that will be applied in relation to that decision. That's not clear from what I've seen. In relation to the composition of the board, I welcome the broad nature of it, and I think, again, this has been asked for repeatedly by different lobby groups in the past. However, I would, and I think Deputy Fitzgerald, the Justice Minister, has already pointed this out, there is room for improving this in terms of community representation on that board. And again, at committee stage, I would ask for that to be looked at. In terms of a general point, the point has been made separately that our prisons really are full of poor people, whether we like it or not. And we can predict at a very early age who's going to end up in prison. And that prediction has never changed. And you might say that poverty is no excuse for crime, and it certainly isn't. However, the fact that prisoners consistently come from a certain class and a certain area has been repeatedly pointed out to us by a very experienced governor of Mountjoy, the former. He repeatedly pointed this out to it, and as a government and as a Dáil, we've utterly failed to look at that, and completely different treatment of white-collar crime. So I would love at some stage of this Dáil term, although Deputy Howlin has referred to a government of chaos, I don't see any chaos, but I hope for the time that we're here that we would look at what we're doing in terms of prison policy and how we're sending the same people to prison over and over. And surely, as Deputy Murphy has said, it has to occur to us that we're doing something wrong in relation to that. It simply isn't working if we're sending the same people to prison over and over again. And in this bill, I would also ask that we look at the balance between when we release somebody. Obviously, as I said, the safety of the clients, the safety of the victims and the community have to be paramount. But in addition, what should be of equal value is what are the chances of rehabilitating the prisoner? Because ultimately, that's what a prison is for as well. In addition to protecting society, it's supposed to serve a rehabilitation role so that when somebody goes to prison, they're better coming out of it than when they went into it. And again, I don't think that's in here in the where I would like to see it, and it's something I would like to come back to. Finally, again, in terms of who exactly is in prison, if we look at what Harry Kennedy, Dr. Kennedy, has said from the Central Remedial Clinic, and he has pointed out that we have 2 beds per 100,000 in the population, by comparison with England, where they have 7.5 beds per 100,000. And so that our prisons are serving as emergency departments, really, for people who are sick and who should be in hospital receiving treatment, and that's not happening, and that's something that we also need to look at. Finally, just in terms of when the decision is made, I welcome the fact that if there's an oral hearing, that the prisoner is entitled to legal representation. And there's also a line in here, I don't remember the section, where he's entitled, or she, to documentation. It doesn't say all documentation, and I think that should be clarified. Are they entitled to all documentation on which the decision is going to be made? Because I would say that is paramount, really, not just some documentation, not relevant documentation, but all of the documentation on which the decision is going to be based. And the section in relation to a victim may be heard is extremely important. However, how will that decision be made? Who will communicate with the victim? If we take somebody who has committed sexual abuse, a prisoner, and there are a number of victims, on the practical side, how will that be dealt with, and how will the victims be notified? It's obviously an essential element of the bill, but on a practical side, how is that going to be dealt with?